The Artist Who Vanished. Unraveling the Dark Secret of the Studio. Hook! Imagine stepping into a studio full of mirrors, only to realize that every reflection hides something or someone who's never left. What if the true price of creation was you? Stay tuned till the end to uncover the dark secret of the disappearing artist and the chilling fate that awaits anyone who dares to enter. The old studio had always been quiet, but tonight there was something different. Elliot stepped inside. The floorboards creaked beneath his feet. The air felt heavy, thick with dust and the scent of oil paints. He had been hired to clean out the place. The famous artist, Raymond Voss, had vanished years ago. No one knew where he went. Some said he simply disappeared, leaving behind his unfinished works. Elliot had always admired Voss from afar. Now he was standing in the very room where the artist had once worked. The walls were lined with unfinished canvases, splattered with wild strokes of color. The only light came from the dim bulbs overhead, casting eerie shadows on the walls. A sudden chill swept through the room. Elliot froze. There was something wrong. A sound came from the back of the studio. It was soft, like a whisper, almost inaudible. He turned toward it. His breath caught in his throat. The door to the back room was slightly ajar. He didn't remember it being open before. Was someone else here? He walked toward it, his footsteps slow and careful. The door creaked open further. Inside was a small room, cluttered with old paintbrushes and tubes of paint. In the center of the room was an easel, and on it a canvas. Elliot's heart raced. The painting was unlike anything he had ever seen. It was a self-portrait, but twisted, distorted. The face was warped, eyes wide and unblinking. But what caught his attention was the signature at the bottom. Raymond Voss. The paint was fresh. Too fresh, as if it had been painted only hours ago. Elliot stepped closer, unable to look away. His hand reached out, trembling. Then he heard a noise behind him. A slow, deliberate breath. Someone was there. He spun around. The room was empty, yet he could feel it. A presence. Something watching him. His pulse quickened, and that's when he saw it. A shadow in the corner of the room, flickering as if it was trying to stay hidden. Elliot's breath caught in his throat. The shadow shifted. It moved closer. He stumbled backward. The door slammed shut, trapping him inside. The room felt smaller now. The walls seemed to close in. A figure stepped from the corner. Raymond Voss. His eyes were hollow, empty. He grinned, a twisted, unsettling smile. "I've been waiting for you," he whispered. And then everything went black when Elliot opened his eyes. The room had changed. It was no longer the cluttered studio. The walls were smooth, sterile white. The floor was cold, metal beneath his bare feet. He was no longer standing. He was lying on something hard, like a table. His body felt heavy, numb. His mind swirled, dizzy from the sudden shift. Where am I? He tried to move, but his limbs wouldn't respond. The air was thick with the smell of chemicals, sharp and suffocating. Elliot's heart pounded in his chest. His vision blurred as he tried to focus. A figure appeared before him, a shadow, tall and thin. The man's face was obscured by a mask, but his eyes gleamed from behind it, cold and piercing. Elliot's throat tightened, but no sound came out. The figure didn't speak. Instead, it gestured for him to follow. Reluctantly, Elliot forced his body to sit up. His hands still felt numb, heavy. Where was he? What was happening? The man turned, walking slowly toward a door at the far end of the room. Elliot tried to stand, his legs unsteady beneath him. He staggered but managed to keep his balance. The man reached the door and paused. He looked over his shoulder, his eyes narrowing. Without saying a word, he pushed the door open. A low, unsettling hum filled the air. Inside was a large chamber. The walls were lined with mirrors. At first, Elliot didn't understand. Then he saw it. In every mirror, there was a version of himself, but they weren't the same. Each reflection looked wrong, twisted. The eyes were hollow, just like Voss's had been. The faces were distorted, warped in ways that felt unnatural. A chill ran down Elliot's spine. He reached out toward the mirror in front of him. The reflection moved before he did. It grinned, a horrible, wide smile. Elliot stumbled back. The figure in the mask watched silently, waiting for something. Elliot's breath came in shallow gasps. He had to get out, had to escape. He turned and ran. The door slammed shut behind him, and in that moment, Elliot realized he wasn't alone. The reflections had followed, that Elliot's pulse raced as he stumbled down the cold, metal corridor. Each step echoed, deafening in the silence. The air grew heavier with each breath. He could feel them, the reflections. They were behind him, just out of sight, but he could sense them. The walls seemed to close in as he ran faster, faster than he thought possible. His heart hammered in his chest. The corridor twisted ahead, dark and endless. He turned a corner and nearly crashed into a wall. But then he saw it. A door, a way out. The handle was cold beneath his trembling fingers. He yanked it open, his eyes wide with fear. But the room inside, it was a mirror. A room made entirely of mirrors. Every direction was nothing but endless reflections of himself. Each image distorted, grotesque, grinning at him with unnatural smiles. He backed away, the door slamming shut behind him. He was trapped. The reflections moved, shifting with a mind of their own. One of them stepped forward. Elliot's breath caught in his throat. It was him, but not him. The face was twisted, a sick parody of his own. The eyes, hollow black, stared directly at him. "Do you see it now?" the reflection whispered, its voice hollow, like an echo in the dark. Elliot froze. The figure grinned wider. "You're part of it now." The words rattled through his mind. He tried to scream, but no sound came. The reflection reached out, its hand pressing against the glass. Elliot tried to move, but his legs wouldn't respond. He was rooted to the spot. The other versions of himself closed in, surrounding him, their grins growing wider. Suddenly he could feel it, cold, sharp fingers on his skin. The mirror was no longer a reflection. It was real. The hand on his shoulder tightened, and he gasped, unable to break free. The reflections were pulling him in, dragging him toward the glass. "No," he whispered. "No, no, no." But it was too late. The glass cracked, splintering, and in a blink, Elliot was sucked into it. The last thing he saw was his own face, staring back at him, alive, twisted, and grinning that Elliot's vision blurred as he was pulled into the mirror. The world around him shifted, melting into a cold, dark void. His body was weightless, suspended in nothingness. He could feel the walls closing in, pressing against him, but there was no way to move, no escape. It was as if the very air had turned to glass, cold and unyielding. Suddenly, a jolt ran through his body, snapping him back into reality. The ground beneath him felt solid, but wrong. It was as though he had been dropped into an unfamiliar place, a world that shouldn't exist. He tried to stand, but his legs were stiff. His surroundings were nothing like the studio, the mirrors, or even the corridor. It was a vast, endless space, barren and dark. There was no light, but somehow he could see. Shapes, vague and shifting, surrounded him. Elliot's heart raced as he realized the truth. These weren't shadows. They were faces, hundreds, maybe thousands of faces, each one identical to his own. Their eyes were all hollow, black voids. The faces flickered in and out, merging with the darkness. They whispered to him, their voices overlapping, indistinguishable from one another. "We're all here. You can't leave. Join us." Elliot's chest tightened. He turned around, desperate to escape the overwhelming presence of these things. But everywhere he looked, there were more faces, more twisted versions of himself, closing in. Each one was grinning. Each one was waiting. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. His mind spun in circles as the faces moved closer, pressing in from all sides. He had to run. There was no choice. Elliot bolted forward, not knowing where he was going, but knowing he couldn't stay. His footsteps echoed in the emptiness. The faces whispered louder now, the words merging into a constant chant. "Join us, join us." A cold hand grabbed his wrist. He screamed, but the scream was swallowed by the darkness, lost in the endless void. The figure was there again, the masked one, and beside it, Raymond Voss. Elliot's heart dropped. The artist's hollow eyes locked onto his. "You never left, Elliot," Voss whispered. "You've always been here." And with that, the faces closed in, swallowing him whole. The darkness consumed him, and the last thing he heard was his own twisted laugh, echoing all around him. That Elliot's world spun. Darkness pressed in from every side, suffocating, consuming. He tried to scream again, but his voice was swallowed, absorbed by the void. There was no escape, no way to fight back. His body felt weightless, like he was floating, yet bound by something unseen, something heavy. The faces surrounded him, their hollow eyes staring, judging. But then he saw it, a light, faint and distant, glowing in the farthest corner of the void. It flickered, almost teasing him, like a beacon of hope. Elliot's breath caught in his throat. Could he reach it? Could he escape this nightmare? His legs trembled as he pushed himself forward. Each step felt like an eternity, the weight of the faces pressing down on him, the whispers growing louder, more urgent. "Come back, join us. Don't run, you belong here." But Elliot didn't stop. The light was getting closer now. His body ached, but he pressed on, ignoring the voices, ignoring the cold hands reaching for him. The light was almost within reach. He could feel the warmth, the pull of it. It was real. The final stretch. He reached out. Suddenly, a sharp pain shot through his chest. A hand, cold and tight, wrapped around his heart. It was the masked figure again, standing in front of the light. Its face was now visible. Raymond Voss. But this time, his eyes were not hollow. They were alive, burning with an eerie intensity. "You can't leave, Elliot," Voss whispered, his voice low and gravelly. "This is your place now. This is where you belong." The hand that had gripped his chest pulled him backward, yanking him away from the light. Elliot struggled, gasping for air, but it was no use. Voss grinned, that same twisted, unsettling smile. "You've already joined us, Elliot. You just didn't know it yet." The faces, all of them, twisted versions of himself, surrounded him again. And this time, they weren't silent. They whispered in unison, their voices low and chilling. "Welcome home." The darkness grew darker, and the light flickered out. Elliot's body went limp, his consciousness fading, his mind overwhelmed by the whispers, the cold, the pressure. He was no longer just a visitor. He was part of it now, part of the endless, hollow faces, a permanent part of the darkness that Elliot's senses began to blur, the line between his body and the void dissolving. He couldn't feel his legs, his arms, only the overwhelming pressure of the faces, his faces, surrounding him, merging with him. Each one a reflection, a twisted version of his own being. They were inside him now. Every whisper, every murmur, invaded his thoughts. "You're one of us. There's no escape. Forever?" His heart pounded, but the rhythm was wrong. It wasn't his heartbeat. It was the pulse of the void itself, a constant thrum, deep and resonant. Elliot wanted to scream, but no sound came. The faces, his faces, crowded in closer, their grins wide, their eyes endless voids. He wanted to tear them away, but they were inside him now, connected to his very soul. "You've always been here," they whispered. "Always." Just like Voss, the thought was suffocating. Elliot tried to resist, to fight against the weight of their presence, but his limbs were like lead. His mind felt as though it was being shredded apart, each piece merging with the void. Then, for a brief moment, there was silence. A sudden stillness that felt colder than the darkness. Elliot blinked, his vision clearing for just an instant. And in that moment, he saw something that made his blood freeze. A mirror. The same mirror he had seen earlier in the studio. But this time, he wasn't just looking at it. He was in it. A twisted version of himself stood in the reflection, eyes wide with terror, but grinning wildly. "Join us," the reflection whispered, its voice echoing in Elliot's mind. And then the reflection reached out. Elliot's hand moved involuntarily, as though controlled by something outside of him. It pressed against the cold glass of the mirror. The image shifted. The reflection stepped through. Elliot's body jerked forward as though yanked by invisible strings. He was pulled through the glass into the reflection. A strange sensation washed over him. He was no longer himself. Not the person who had entered that studio. Not the man who had hoped for escape. He was one of them now, a shadow among countless others. And as he looked around, he realized he wasn't alone. All the faces were there. All of them trapped like him. They had never left. And neither would he. The glass surrounding Elliot shattered, but the pieces didn't fall. They suspended in midair, frozen in time, like 1,000 tiny reflections of himself. He tried to scream, but no sound escaped his lips. His body felt lighter, ethereal, but the pressure, the suffocating weight of those hollow eyes, remained. The faces surrounded him, pressing in from every direction. Each face was an echo of his own, twisted and contorted in endless variations. There was no escape from their gaze. His hands trembled, reaching out, but they were all around him now. He were everywhere. And then he saw something that made his stomach drop. At the far end of the space, there was a figure. It was Voss, but not the way Elliot remembered him. This version of Voss was a silhouette, a shadow, his form barely distinguishable from the darkness. But his eyes, those hollow, empty eyes, locked onto Elliot's. "You see now, don't you?" Voss's voice echoed, distorted, all around him. Elliot's breath hitched. This was the place. This was where they all came to be, where they disappeared, where they stayed. There was no escape. His body moved without his control, turning toward the figure. He didn't want to look, but he had to. The shadows around Voss shifted, revealing a row of mirrors, each one distorted in the same way, each one a different version of Elliot, his twisted selves, forever trapped in their reflections. One by one, each of his faces grinned, their hollow eyes watching him, waiting. "Welcome home, Elliot." The words echoed again. A chill ran down his spine. He realized the truth now, the truth he had been running from. There was no exit. There was no way back to his old life. He had become part of it, part of the gallery, part of the endless collection of distorted faces, forever trapped. As his reflection in the nearest mirror grinned back at him, a chilling realization settled over him. Elliot was no longer the one who had entered this place. He had become one of them, and like all the others who had come before him, he would never leave. The last echo of his own voice whispered, barely audible, "Forever?" And then there was nothing. That Elliot's mind became an empty void, the echoes of his past life slipping further and further away. The faces surrounded him, but now they weren't just reflections. They were him. He was them. Each twisted version of himself locked in place, a permanent part of the dark, endless space. The whispers grew louder. "Join us." Forever? The words were no longer distant. They were inside him, vibrating through his very bones. There was no distinction between Elliot and the others anymore. His thoughts, his feelings, his identity, they all blurred, dissolved into the collective. But then a flicker of awareness stirred. A thought, a fragment of something, a memory of what he had been before, who he had been before this madness. It was so faint, like a distant shadow. He could barely grasp it, but it was there. A voice, his voice, pushed through the haze. Asterisk no, asterisk. But the voice was weak, almost inaudible. I don't belong here. A flicker of resistance. He tried to pull himself free, to claw at the fabric of this nightmare. But the grip of the darkness was too strong. The faces closed in tighter, their grins widening, their hollow eyes gleaming with twisted joy. "You can't leave," they said in unison. "You never really did." The thought froze him, paralyzed. His mind, once clear, had been shattered, now held hostage in this endless realm. Elliot wasn't just trapped. He was part of it, forever. The figure of Raymond Voss appeared again, stepping from the shadows. His eyes, those cold, empty eyes, locked onto Elliot. A strange, twisted satisfaction lingered on Voss's face. "You wanted to understand," Voss said softly, his voice dripping with something dark, something ancient. "You wanted to know the truth of the studio, of the disappearing artist. Now, you are the truth." Elliot's chest tightened. The finality of Voss's words crushed him. There was no escape. The faces around him weren't just his past. They were his future, and in the endless, oppressive dark, Elliot understood. There was no end, only a reflection of himself. Trapped. Forever the darkness around Elliot deepened, swallowing him whole. It pressed against his chest, the weight unbearable, suffocating. He could no longer feel the ground beneath him, nor the air in his lungs. Everything was a blur, a relentless void of faces, whispers, and his own fractured thoughts. No escape. The words echoed in his mind, louder than any of the whispers surrounding him. He wanted to move, to run, but his body was not his own. It had become a part of the space, a vessel for the endless reflections, locked in place like the others. Every twisted version of himself that surrounded him seemed to speak at once, their voices merging into a single, unified chant. Asterisk, we are one. You are one, asterisk. Elliot tried to scream, but no sound escaped. He was drowning in his own mind, drowning in the faces of himself. But in the chaos he felt it, a shift, a ripple in the darkness. For a split second, the faces around him flickered, their smiles faltering. The darkness seemed to tremble, as if it were alive, uncertain. It was a crack in the facade, a flicker of hope, or perhaps madness. Elliot reached toward it, his trembling hands desperate. For the first time, his body responded. He pushed against the invisible force that held him, his limbs moving with an instinct he hadn't felt before. The flickering light from the edges of the void seemed to pull him, a fragile thread of something real, something human. He surged forward, forcing himself through the pressing walls of darkness and faces. They fought him, pulling him back, their hollow eyes burning into him, their voices growing frantic. "You can't leave. You belong to us." But Elliot's will pushed back harder, tearing at the fabric of the void. A sudden crack echoed in the distance, and then everything stopped. The world held its breath. The faces ceased their endless whispers. The pressure that had been suffocating him lifted for a moment. It was like being born again. And in that brief silence, Elliot found himself standing, alone. The void was gone. The faces had vanished. There was only silence. The air around him was crisp, clean, and as he looked around, he realized where he was. The studio. The studio, once so familiar, now felt different. The canvases still lined the walls. The smell of oil paint still lingered in the air. But it wasn't the same. He wasn't the same. He turned toward the back room, the one where the mirror had stood. The door was ajar. Slowly, cautiously, Elliot approached. He stepped inside, and there on the easel was the final piece. A painting of himself, but not the twisted version he had seen before. This one was clear, real, untouched. He stared at it for what felt like hours. It was him, but it wasn't. A part of him wanted to reach out, to touch it, but something held him back. For in the reflection on the canvas, he saw not just himself, but 1,000 versions of himself, all staring back, their eyes hollow. And behind them, a shadow stood. Raymond Voss, his empty eyes locked onto Elliot's. "You're not free," Voss whispered, his voice a cold breath against Elliot's ear. "You never were." And as the shadow stretched toward him, the studio door slammed shut. The painting, once lifeless, began to move, and Elliot understood. He was still there, the air in the studio grew thick, heavier than before. Elliot's pulse quickened as he stared at the painting, the one of himself. It shifted, just slightly at first, a subtle movement like the brushstrokes were alive. Then the eyes in the painting blinked. The figure within it grinned, a twisted, knowing smile. Elliot stumbled back, his heart racing. He was no longer sure of what was real and what wasn't. The room seemed to warp, the walls closing in, the shadows growing longer, darker. The shadow behind the painting stretched, rising from the canvas, until it was no longer just an image. It was a figure, a dark silhouette that loomed over him, taller than any man, its presence suffocating. Raymond Voss, the artist, was there, not just in the painting, but standing before him. Elliot's breath caught. "Do you see?" Voss's voice was low, dark, seeping into Elliot's mind like a poison. "You wanted to understand. You wanted to leave. But now you know." The figure stepped closer, its form flickering like an image in a broken mirror. "You never really left." Elliot felt the words seep into his very soul. He tried to move, to escape, but his feet felt glued to the floor. The studio felt smaller now, the shadows pressing in, the weight of them crushing. Voss's empty eyes gleamed as he reached out. "Come closer. See the truth." Elliot couldn't fight it anymore. His body moved on its own, controlled by some unseen force. The paintings on the walls seemed to distort, becoming more vivid, more real. Each one, an image of him, some smiling, others twisted in pain, some with eyes closed in eternal slumber. And then he saw it. In the corner of the room, hidden beneath a layer of dust, was another canvas. This one was different. It wasn't a painting. It was a mirror, a blackened, cracked mirror that reflected nothing but darkness. Voss stood before it, his figure fading in and out of focus. "Step inside," Voss whispered. Elliot's body obeyed. He didn't want to, but he couldn't stop himself. He walked toward the mirror, his reflection fading, becoming something else. The whispers returned, louder this time, filling his ears, his mind, his heart. "Asterisk, join us. You are one of us. Forever, asterisk." The edges of the mirror rippled like water, pulling him in. Elliot reached out, his hands trembling as he touched the cold surface. And as his fingers made contact with the glass, the world collapsed around him. The last thing he saw before everything went black was his own face, twisted and grinning back at him, lost in the reflection. And then there was nothing, just darkness, and the endless echo of his own voice, calling from somewhere far away. Forever? The darkness lingered, suffocating, endless. Elliot's body was weightless, suspended in an infinite void, his mind unable to grasp time, place, or reality. There was nothing, only the echoes of his name, his own voice, swirling around him, taunting him. Forever? It reverberated through the blackness like a cruel mantra. The sensation of being lost in the dark, unable to move, unable to think clearly, consumed him. But then, a flicker, a light, a distant glow that beckoned. Elliot's consciousness snapped to it. He felt himself pulled toward it, drawn in against his will, as if the light was the only thing that could break the suffocating weight of the darkness. He reached for it, his limbs moving, though they felt foreign, disconnected. The light grew brighter, sharper, until it flooded his vision. And there, standing before him, was the mirror again. The one he had touched before. The one that had swallowed him. Only this time, the glass was whole, unbroken. He stepped toward it hesitant, feeling a deep sense of dread wash over him. As his hand hovered near the surface, the reflection appeared. But it wasn't his face. It was something else. A twisted version of himself, smiling with that same sick grin, the eyes hollow, devoid of life. The figure in the reflection moved closer, almost as if it were about to reach through the mirror and pull him in. Elliot backed away, his heart racing. No, he couldn't go back there. He couldn't. But then, the reflection in the mirror changed. It began to shift, to contort, until it was no longer his face at all. It was Voss, Raymond Voss. His grin widened, and the hollow eyes stared directly at Elliot, full of cold, twisted amusement. "You can't escape," Voss whispered, his voice piercing through the mirror, reverberating inside Elliot's mind. Elliot's chest tightened as the shadows around him grew darker, more oppressive. The mirror rippled, the surface distorting like liquid. Voss's reflection reached through the glass, extending a hand toward him, and without thinking, Elliot reached out. His fingers brushed the cold surface. For a moment, everything went still, but then the mirror shattered. The glass exploded, shards flying outward, and Elliot was once again pulled in. This time, there was no studio, no light, no air, only the endless darkness and the hollow, grinning faces. And as the shards of the mirror dissolved into the void, Elliot understood. He was a part of it now, trapped in the gallery, forever. Elliot felt himself fall, deeper and deeper into the abyss, the void swallowing him whole. The faces, those twisted versions of himself, surrounded him once again, their hollow eyes fixed on him, unblinking, unyielding. Their grins were sharper now, more grotesque, as though the darkness had twisted them further. He couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. The air was thick with their presence, suffocating. The whispering began again, louder this time, filling his mind with unbearable pressure. Asterisk, you are one of us now, asterisk. Asterisk, you never left, asterisk. Asterisk forever, asterisk. His pulse raced in his ears, but no matter how much he screamed, no sound came. His vision blurred as the faces pressed in from every angle, and then a sharp crack broke through the silence. It was as if the entire world was shattering. Elliot's body jerked violently, but it wasn't his own doing. Someone was controlling him. He was no longer a man trapped in a nightmare. He had become the nightmare. The figure of Raymond Voss appeared once more, standing in front of him, his figure dissolving into the dark, like a shadow made of glass. "You never understood, did you, Elliot?" Voss's voice, low and mocking, drifted through the swirling darkness. "Everything you've seen, everything you've felt, this is your reality now. The artist doesn't vanish. He is created." The words cut through Elliot's mind like a blade. He was shaking, not from fear anymore, but from something deeper, something insidious. The realization that Voss was right. He wasn't just a victim of this place. He was part of it, part of the endless gallery of trapped souls, all reflections of the same artist's twisted visions. The grinning faces that surrounded him, all his faces, began to close in tighter, and he could feel their presence seeping into his body, into his very soul. Each touch, each whisper, each movement of those distorted reflections sank deeper into him. They were becoming him, and he was becoming them. Suddenly he felt the pull again, not from the darkness, but from inside himself. He was no longer sure if it was his mind thinking or the faces, the reflections, speaking through him. He was the darkness now. He was the reflection. Join us, he gasped, as though he was awakening from a nightmare. But there was no awakening. The world around him solidified into a grotesque clarity. The faces were his own, and he realized he had become the next piece in the collection, no longer trapped in the gallery, but the one who would create it. The final brushstroke, the next artist to disappear. Forever Elliot stood in the center of the endless void, but now the weight of the darkness didn't suffocate him. It consumed him, enveloped him completely, until he became a part of it. His mind, once his own, had melted into the very fabric of this place, indistinguishable from the countless twisted reflections that surrounded him. He felt it, felt himself becoming the next face. He saw it in the eyes of the countless figures around him, all grinning, all waiting. They were no longer just shadows. They were him, and he was them. A thought, a whisper, a flicker of something, his name, echoed through his mind. Elliot. But it wasn't just his voice. It was every voice, every distorted version of himself that had ever been trapped here. He was no longer just the one who entered the studio. He was the studio. He was the artist. The realization hit him with brutal clarity. He wasn't just a part of the collection. He had become the collection. Elliot's hands, no, his hands were no longer his. They were the brushstrokes of a creator who had long since lost their humanity. He was an artist of suffering, of souls trapped in endless cycles of reflection. The gallery wasn't just a place of disappearance. It was a place of creation, a place where reality itself was molded by the will of the artist, each new piece born from darkness, each face twisted by the brush. And now Elliot understood. The true horror wasn't the disappearance. It was the creation. The artist did not vanish. The artist was consumed, a part of an endless, eternal cycle of twisted reflections and faces. He was the one now pulling others into the void, trapping them in the endless gallery, making them the next piece, the next twisted reflection. The thought of escape vanished. There was no escape. There was only the creation. Elliot's eyes, his face, twisted into a grotesque grin, one that mirrored all the others surrounding him. It was the final piece. He stepped forward, his form flickering, distorting as it merged with the endless darkness. And in that moment, as he became one with the void, he heard it, his own voice, joined with the others. Asterisk forever asterisk. And the gallery, infinite and eternal, waited for its next victim. The void stretched on endlessly, an ocean of faces, whispers, and hollow eyes. Elliot's presence, now woven into the fabric of this twisted place, resonated with every distorted reflection. The faces, the countless faces, continued to surround him, their hollow eyes never blinking, their twisted grins ever present. He felt the pull again, the insatiable urge to create, to trap, to pull another soul into the endless cycle. But as he moved, something shifted. A tremor ran through the darkness, like the space itself was questioning, resisting. The walls of the gallery trembled, the faces flickering like broken glass. For the first time, the whispers became frantic, disjointed, like 1,000 voices crying out at once. Asterisk don't, asterisk no, asterisk not again, asterisk. Elliot stopped, his mind, no, the minds of all the reflections, reaching out in confusion. What was this feeling? The darkness, the gallery, the faces, they seemed to tremble, to falter. There was a crack, a tiny fissure in the space, where the edges of the void began to fray, like a tear in reality itself. Elliot reached for it instinctively, drawn to the breach, his fingers trembling as they brushed against it. And then a surge of light, bright, blinding, cutting through the darkness like a blade. The gallery, the void, seemed to recoil, to retreat as the light burned through the cracks. For a moment, Elliot felt something he hadn't in what felt like an eternity. Hope. A fleeting, fragile thing that flickered within him. Could this be escape? Could the gallery be undone? The light expanded, its warmth consuming the edges of the dark, erasing the shadows, the faces, the twisted reflections. But just as it seemed that the void would collapse in on itself, the light began to flicker, to fade. The cracks in the darkness grew larger, and with each passing moment, the gallery fought back. The faces, Elliot's faces, grinned wider, their eyes filled with rage, hatred, as if they were determined to stop this. No, no. The voices screamed in unison. The gallery was fighting for its survival, and it wasn't going to let Elliot go that easily. He tried to resist, to push against the overwhelming tide of darkness, but the faces closed in, their whispers louder, more insistent. Asterisk, you belong here, asterisk. Asterisk, you are one of us, asterisk. But as the light flickered one last time, Elliot felt it. A crack of clarity, a flicker of something pure. For the first time since he'd entered the studio, he remembered. The feeling of paint on canvas, the warmth of the sun outside the gallery, the sound of his own breath in a room full of silence. He remembered who he was, who he had been, a man who sought the truth, a man who wanted to escape. And now, perhaps for the first time, Elliot understood the true nature of the gallery. It wasn't just a place to trap souls. It was a place of creation, yes, but it was also a prison for the artist. And now, as the darkness began to swallow him once more, he knew the truth. The artist never escapes, not from the gallery, not from himself. And as the light finally flickered out and the gallery reclaimed its hold, Elliot's voice joined the others, forever lost in the echoes of a never-ending cycle. Forever? And the gallery waited, patient, for the next artist to arrive. The gallery pulsed with silence, but the silence was not empty. It was thick with the weight of countless souls, trapped waiting, their grins never fading. Elliot's presence, though fading, lingered within the void, a part of the darkness itself. The endless cycle had begun again. Another artist would come, another soul would be drawn into the web of creation, only to become a reflection, a piece of the eternal collection. The studio, so once alive with the hum of creativity, now stood still, its walls blank, its air heavy with the memory of what had been. But that was the way of the gallery. It waited. It always waited. And somewhere, far beyond the endless void, the world continued, unaware, unknowing. Another artist would step into the studio one day, just as Elliot had. They would feel the pull. They would begin to question, to search for something they couldn't define. They would wander through the studio, unaware of the fate that awaited them. And they would come face to face with the mirror, the one that reflected not just their own image, but the darkest version of themselves. And just as Elliot had, they would reach out, compelled, drawn in. And as they stepped closer, closer still to the surface of that glass, they would see what lay beneath. The faces, the twisted reflections. They would understand, just as Elliot had. They would realize that there was no escape. They would become part of it, part of the gallery. The gallery would be complete once more, and it would wait again. For the next artist, the gallery, endless and dark, continued its silent, eternal existence, a waiting place for lost souls, for artists who would unknowingly step into its grip. It was a cycle without end, a pattern of creation, reflection, and capture that never broke. The walls, once filled with expectation and the scent of fresh paint, were now coated in a deep, unsettling stillness. Nothing moved, nothing changed. But there was a shift deep within the gallery's heart, a ripple through the fabric of the void. The studio doors, long sealed, creaked open once again, a thin sliver of light cutting through the darkness. A new presence stepped inside, a man, young and eager, with the eyes of an artist who had yet to see the true price of his ambition. His name was Sebastian. Like all before him, he had heard the whispers, the tales of the legendary studio, the one where artists were said to disappear into their own works. He entered with curiosity. He entered with the same hunger for truth. And as he moved through the empty space, the shadows seemed to shift with him, stretching and pulling at the edges of his vision. The air smelled of dust and forgotten dreams. He felt the weight of the studio, a strange heaviness that seemed to press against his chest. But he brushed it off as his imagination. The mirrors on the walls caught his attention, reflecting not just his own image, but something more. The deeper he looked, the more the faces seemed to shift, to grow more real. Each reflection seemed to whisper to him, beckoning him closer, promising understanding, offering him the power to create as the great artists of old had. Sebastian's pulse quickened. He couldn't resist. His fingers brushed the nearest mirror, cold and smooth, as though it had been waiting for him. And for the briefest moment he saw something. A face. Not his own, but a face. Twisted, grinning, hollow-eyed. It stared back at him with an eerie familiarity. The face was Elliot's. Sebastian pulled his hand back, heart racing. But the pull was already there. It was in the air, in the very fabric of the studio. It was calling to him, inviting him to step closer. The whispers, now louder, filled his ears. Asterisk, join us, asterisk. Asterisk, become one with us, asterisk. The reflection of Elliot in the mirror grinned wider, the hollow eyes dark, with something ancient, something hungry. Sebastian stepped back, shaking his head, but his feet moved forward as though against his will. The light from the cracked door flickered and faded, leaving only shadows in its wake. He was trapped, and he didn't even know it yet. The cycle was beginning again, and the gallery was waiting. Sebastian's breath came in shallow gasps as he stood frozen in front of the mirror, his eyes locked on the twisted reflection of Elliot, whose grin seemed to widen with every passing second. The silence that enveloped the studio now felt suffocating. It pressed against his chest, making it harder to breathe, harder to think. His body, though willing to run, felt paralyzed, each step forward drawing him closer to the cold, glass surface of the mirror. His hand hovered in the air, trembling, as if it belonged to someone else. The whispers, now louder than ever, hummed in his ears. Asterisk, come closer, asterisk. Asterisk, join us. Sebastian, asterisk. He felt a cold sweat break out across his skin. His name echoed in the void, distorted by the dark force that held the studio in its grip. But there was no turning back now. His fingers finally brushed the mirror's surface, and instantly, his reflection rippled like water disturbed by a stone. For a split second, he saw it. The flicker of another face beneath his own. The face of someone who had been here before. Someone who had stood in this same spot, touching this same mirror, and had never left. It was Elliot. And then everything changed. The mirror cracked. A low, sickening sound echoed through the studio as the glass splintered, sending shards flying in every direction. The pieces of the broken mirror fell to the floor, yet Sebastian remained rooted in place, his heart hammering in his chest. For the first time, he felt a hand on his shoulder, a cold, skeletal touch that made his skin crawl. Slowly, Sebastian turned, and there, standing behind him, was the figure of Elliot. But it wasn't Elliot as he remembered from the fleeting vision. It was Elliot, or what was left of him. His face, though human, was stretched in a grotesque smile, his eyes black, hollow. The once vibrant artist had become something else, an echo of himself, twisted by the void, by the endless cycle of creation and destruction. Sebastian wanted to scream, to run, but his voice was lost. His body refused to obey. "You found your way in," Elliot's voice rasped, but it wasn't quite his voice. It was a chorus of 1,000 voices, distorted, trapped, all whispering in unison. "You wanted to create." Sebastian tried to shake his head, his mind screaming that this was wrong, that he didn't belong here. But the faces, the reflections, began to appear all around him. More and more of them, all staring at him, their hollow eyes locked on his every move. "We've all created," Elliot whispered, stepping closer, his form flickering in and out like a dying flame. "The studio is alive. It feeds on creation. It requires it." Sebastian stumbled back, but his feet couldn't find purchase. The shadows were pulling him in, just like they had pulled Elliot before him. And slowly, piece by piece, the gallery began to change. The walls warped. The faces on the canvases shifted, becoming more vivid, more real. Sebastian realized, too late, what was happening. The studio wasn't just a place where artists disappeared. It was a place where they became art. It wasn't about what they created. It was about what the studio created out of them. With each step, the darkness around him thickened, and the walls of the gallery seemed to close in. His own reflection, distorted and twisted by the growing void, smiled back at him from every surface, each one more grotesque than the last. He could feel it now. The studio was claiming him. He was being consumed by it, a new face added to its endless gallery of trapped souls. "No, no!" he screamed, but his voice was drowned out by the laughter of the faces. "You're already part of it," Elliot said, his eyes gleaming. "You always were." And as the shadows surrounded him, wrapping him in their cold embrace, Sebastian's form began to flicker, to dissolve, until he was no more than a reflection, another piece of the gallery. The gallery was complete, and it waited for the next artist. The studio stood still, silent once again, the cycle continuing, as it always had. Sebastian's absence was felt in the gallery, but his reflection remained, trapped within the walls, flickering in every mirror, every canvas, his twisted grin joining the others. The air was thick with the weight of countless souls, the space pulsing with the energy of creation, destruction, and endless repetition. The gallery, its endless void, remained ever hungry, ever patient. Outside, the world continued, unaware, unchanged. And yet, in the quiet of the studio, something shifted. A new presence approached. A shadow slipped through the cracks of reality, drawn in by the same pull that had lured every artist before. The door creaked open, just as it had for Elliot, for Sebastian, for all of them. A man stepped inside, his footsteps light, unsure. His name was Oliver. He had heard the stories, the legends of the haunted studio. He had heard of the artists who vanished, never to be seen again. And like the others, he sought the truth. He wanted to understand. He wanted to create. But as he walked into the dimly lit space, something fell off. He could feel it in his bones, in the air that seemed to cling to his skin, heavy and cold. The studio was watching him. Oliver hesitated, looking around the room, his eyes falling on the paintings that lined the walls. Each one seemed to stare at him, as though they were alive, their faces full of yearning. And there, in the corner of the room, he saw it, the mirror. The cracked, jagged edges of the glass shimmered in the dim light, its surface beckoning. The whispers, faint but growing louder, filled the air. Asterisk, come closer, asterisk. Asterisk, you belong here, asterisk. Oliver stepped forward, his body moving on its own accord. The studio, the paintings, the reflections, they all called to him. And as his hand reached out, trembling, toward the surface of the glass, he saw it. A face, a distorted, grotesque face. Elliot, Sebastian. Faces, asterisk his asterisk face, twisted, contorted into monstrous smiles. They stared back at him, eyes hollow, mouth stretching wide. "Join us," The faces whispered, their voices 1,000 echoes. Oliver's heart raced, panic rising in his chest. He knew what was happening, but it was too late. The reflection was already pulling him in. His hand, now trapped in the mirror's cold surface, couldn't move. The glass seemed to melt around him, warping, bending, pulling his body toward the endless darkness within. Asterisk you will create now, asterisk. The voice was everywhere. It was Elliot. It was Sebastian. It was the gallery itself. Asterisk you will never leave, asterisk. Oliver struggled, trying to break free. But the more he fought, the more the shadows enveloped him. The walls of the studio seemed to close in, and with a final scream that was swallowed by the darkness, he became just another reflection, just another piece of the collection. The gallery, now filled with yet another soul, fell back into its eternal silence, and it waited for the next artist to arrive. The gallery was still. Its walls were lined with the faces of those who had entered, each one a reflection of the artist they once were, their grins twisted by the endless void. Oliver's form flickered in one of the mirrors, his face now another piece of the gallery's collection. His hollow eyes stared back at him, a silent scream frozen on his lips. The studio was complete, yet it was never finished. It always waited. The door, long closed, creaked once more. The subtle shift in the air signaled the arrival of a new presence. This time a woman. Her name was Clara. She had come seeking inspiration, a break from the mundane, a chance to create something extraordinary. Her footsteps were soft on the wooden floor, hesitant as she entered the dim space. The silence of the studio pressed against her, cold and heavy. She had heard the rumors, the warnings, but she didn't believe them. After all, she was an artist. She was different. She could feel it in her fingertips as she traced the edges of a canvas. Her mind buzzed with ideas, visions of what she could create. But as she stepped deeper into the studio, she saw them. The faces, the reflections. They were everywhere, staring at her, watching, waiting. Their hollow eyes filled her with a sense of unease, a cold shiver crawling up her spine. She turned, looking for something to distract her from the mounting discomfort. And then she saw it. The mirror. Its surface was cracked, jagged edges catching the faint light that filtered through the room. The air seemed to shift around it, growing thicker with each step she took toward it. Her heart beat faster as she reached out, drawn to it despite the chill creeping through her veins. Her fingers brushed the cold surface, and then it happened. A figure appeared in the mirror, not hers, but someone else's, a man. His twisted smile was familiar. It was Elliot's face, but it wasn't him. The eyes black, hollow, voids of endless darkness. The reflection moved, shifting closer. Clara stumbled back, panic flooding her chest. The figure in the mirror grinned wider. And then there were more. Sebastian, Oliver. Faces, countless faces, all staring back at her, their mouths stretching unnaturally. Asterisk you can't leave, asterisk. The voices came in unison, echoing in the silence. Clara's breath caught in her throat as she tried to move away, but the mirror seemed to pull her in, drawing her closer to the endless abyss behind it. Her feet wouldn't obey, her legs rooted to the floor. The whispers grew louder, the faces pressing against the glass, their distorted features contorting as if in agony. Asterisk you belong here, asterisk. Clara reached for the door, her hand trembling, but it was too late. The mirror's surface rippled, the darkness swallowing the room around her. And before she could make another sound, the studio claimed her. Her form flickered in the glass, joining the others. Another face added to the endless gallery. The cycle continued. The door remained open, and the gallery waited for the next artist. The studio had fallen silent once again, the walls now filled with a new face, Clara's. Her reflection stood among the others, her eyes hollow, her smile frozen in an eerie, twisted expression. The gallery, endless and dark, seemed to pulse with the energy of those who had entered and become part of it. It was a living thing, breathing, waiting, constantly in flux. And yet, despite the stillness, a shift began. Something deeper, darker, stirring within the heart of the void. A figure moved through the shadows, its shape vague, indistinct, yet undeniably present. The gallery seemed to hold its breath, as though waiting for the next step to unfold. The studio, with its endless corridors of canvases and mirrors, waited. The door creaked open again, though no one had entered. A figure appeared in the doorway, but this time it was not like the others. It was not a new artist seeking inspiration or understanding. It was something else entirely. The air grew heavy with the sense of inevitability. The figure stepped forward, its presence commanding, suffocating. It was the artist, the creator, standing at the threshold of his own creation. The one who had built this place, who had shaped the gallery and its endless cycle. The figure paused before the broken mirrors, before the twisted faces of those who had become part of his work. His eyes, once full of ambition and thirst for perfection, were now empty. The cycle had consumed him as it had the others. The gallery, though it had once been his creation, was now his prison. His fingers, trembling, reached out, touching the cold glass of the nearest mirror. For the first time in an eternity, he saw it, saw himself. Not just his reflection, but the twisted versions of himself that had been created along the way, each one grinning hollow-eyed, trapped within the endless cycle of creation. And he realized with sickening clarity that he too was a part of it. The gallery had never been about capturing the souls of others. It had always been about capturing his own. And now, as his hand sank into the mirror, the darkness closed in, pulling him in deeper. The faces surrounded him, their whispers filling his ears. Asterisk, you are one of us, asterisk. And in that final, chilling moment, the artist became just another reflection, another face in the collection. The cycle continued. The gallery waited. Forever the gallery, eternal and boundless, stood in silent anticipation. The faces, endless and distorted, flickered across the mirrors. Elliot, Sebastian, Clara, the artist himself, all trapped in the reflections. The studio had claimed them, molded them into part of its twisted masterpiece. And yet, beyond the endless corridors of canvas and shadow, there was a quiet stillness, a profound emptiness. For the first time in what felt like eternity, the studio seemed to pause, to breathe in a way that only a living thing could. Perhaps the cycle was winding down. Perhaps the gallery, having taken so many, had finally grown weary. But just as hope dared to flicker in the darkest corners, something stirred, something old and forgotten, like the slow awakening of a slumbering beast. The door, long shut and sealed by time, creaked once more, and in the threshold, a new figure stood. She was not like the others. She was different. Her eyes were not drawn by the whispers or the promises of the gallery. She stepped into the studio with a quiet confidence, her gaze steady, unfazed by the faces staring from the walls. Her name was Evelyn. She had come not for inspiration or to be claimed, but with a purpose. She had heard the stories, yes. She had seen the disappearances, the legends of the artists who had vanished without a trace. But Evelyn, unlike the others, had never believed in the supernatural. She was a skeptic and investigator. Her only goal was to uncover the truth behind the myths. And so, as she stood at the threshold, Evelyn surveyed the studio with the keen eyes of a detective, her heart beating in steady rhythm, undeterred by the eerie atmosphere. The mirrors beckoned, their fractured surfaces shimmering with an unsettling allure. But Evelyn was no artist. She was a seeker of answers. She stepped forward, undeterred by the walls, the whispers, the faces. Her hand hovered over the surface of a mirror. But instead of reaching out, she stood still, studying the glass, the reflections, the endless cycle of creation and destruction. She knew something the others didn't. She knew that the power of the gallery, the true horror, was in not becoming part of it. The gallery waited, its hunger always there, always watching. But Evelyn, for the first time in ages, refused to be claimed. She turned, stepping back toward the door, her eyes never leaving the faces of the studio. And for the first time, the gallery remained still. The cycle had been broken. And with that, the door closed, the studio falling back into silence as it waited for the next artist